Well, I'm excited that it's that time of year again. It is the feast of the Passover here in the city of Jerusalem. The city is full of pilgrims right now from all over the Mediterranean world who've come to attend this great national festival where we can all celebrate together our ancestors and their release from slavery in the land of Egypt. That's a story that I have been taught since I was a very, very small child. Now keep in mind that we are all still effectively slaves to these new oppressors, the Romans. And although most of us are afraid to say this too loudly, we want our freedom from them, much like our ancestors wanted freedom from the Egyptians. Some of us are more zealous than others, and there are those who will actively fight the Romans through different terrorist activities. There's even a band of freedom fighters known as the Zealots. Although the Romans would never publicly admit this, I think that the unpredictability of these zealots has become a concern to them. But back to the Passover. The city was not just overwhelmed with pilgrims today, but it was also overwhelmed with Roman soldiers. They were sent here to ensure that things remained peaceful. Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator, actually brought most of his own soldiers from his headquarters in Caesarea Philippi to keep the peace first, and secondly, to capture or kill the zealots. The city's population more than quadruples in size during the Passover feast. And the temple, the focus of the Passover festivities, is always a hive of activity. All male Jews within a radius of 15 miles have to come and appear in the temple, and they are bringing a young lamb as a sacrifice. Its blood being collected in these beautiful golden bowls and then thrown at the foot of the altar. After the sacrifice, the lambs are then taken back home and roasted on spits and eaten. And during the meal, the eldest child was always expected to ask the father questions about the first Passover in the land of Egypt. That was my role. I was the one that would come up with the questions and ask them. It was on that night of our celebration that Jesus, after celebrating the Passover with his disciples, was arrested. You know, a lot of us think that our religious leaders were afraid that Jesus and his disciples were about to ruin everything for us. Our religious leaders were afraid that the Romans would deem him and his followers to be zealots, and then the Passover would be ruined for everyone. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that that is Jesus' way. He's just different in that way. Yes, my friends, and I think that our Jewish leaders are afraid of him. People seem to follow him with such passion, and every new follower for Jesus was a follower that they didn't have. And we all think that they were motivated by jealousy. So apparently, as the story was told to me, they arrested Jesus and took him to see Anos. Anos is nothing but a sellout, if you ask me, and everyone knew that he was notoriously the power behind the throne in Jerusalem. Anos has been the high priest since AD 6, and as I understand it, his 4 sons will take the job after him. Caiaphas was his son-in-law, and that's the only reason that he was hired. Rumor has it that he was born out of an incestuous relationship. You know, there was once a time when the Jews were free to choose their own high priest, when the high priest held the office for life, but when the Roman governors came, well, they wanted to appoint the high priest. And we all knew that Anos was a sellout. He didn't speak for us, he didn't represent us, and he certainly didn't represent God. Rumor has it, and I tend to believe this, that the role of the high priest was sold to the highest bidder and to the man most willing to toe the party line for the Romans. But we saw it for what it was. It has become an office of bribery and corruption. The high priest was nothing but a Roman collaborator, and he was a man who used money and bribes to buy comfort and ease and prestige and power, all at the cost of close cooperation with our nation's enemies, with our oppressors. The family of Annas was immensely rich, and one by one they had all bribed their way into some sort of political office. Even the way that Annas made his money, it was disgraceful. You might not know this, and if anyone should ask, you didn't hear it from me, okay? But in the court of the Gentiles, there were these sellers of the animals for the temple sacrifices. Those were the ones that Jesus had driven out of the temple courts. They were not traders. They were not shepherds. They were extortioners. As you know, every animal that was offered in the temple had to be without spot and blemish. And there were these inspectors that had been put in place to see that that was mandated. And if an animal was brought in for sacrifice from outside of the temple, it had to be inspected and examined, and it was almost certain that a flaw would be found. The worshiper would then be directed to go to the temple stalls and buy a new animal that had already been examined and was at no risk of being rejected. It was nothing more than a sham, though, just another way of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. The markup for buying one of these temple sheep, it was always close to 1,500%. The stalls where these temple animals were sold happened to be called the Bazaars of Annas. Do you know why they were called that? You guessed it. They were the property of the family of Annas. He owned all of it, and he used it to rip off the worshipers. In fact, this is how Annas had amassed his fortune. Jesus was really the first one who had attacked Annas' vested interest. Jesus was the man who had cleared the temple of the sellers and the traders, and who would hit Annas where it hurt, in his pocket and in his bank account. So most of us believe that it was Annas who ordered the hit on Jesus that night. Most of us believe that it was he who had Jesus arrested in the garden. In fact, most of us believe that he didn't want to risk his livelihood by keeping Jesus around anymore. Ultimately, Jesus, when he was questioned by Caiaphas, the high priest, he asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus answered, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And it's so interesting to note that this line of questioning violated the very principle of the Jewish justice system. But Jesus never had a hope of justice. The self-interest of Annas and Caiaphas had been threatened, and so Jesus was condemned before he was even tried. Jesus threatened the very profitable business of Annas and Caiaphas, so they thought he has to go. So Caiaphas charged Jesus with blasphemy, and punishment for that, according to the Jewish law, was death by either stoning or by strangulation. So you might be wondering why it all didn't end there. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. You know, there were a lot of people who saw Jesus as the promised Messiah. And they responded as such when he entered the city on the first Palm Sunday. They yelled, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest," they shouted. The last thing Annas and Caiaphas wanted to do was to distract the pilgrims away from their lucrative business in the temple and bring their office into some kind of disrepute with the Romans. They also wanted to keep the peace and didn't want to give the Romans an excuse to question their ability to keep the Jewish people in line. The last thing they wanted was a riot and a mob that was angry over the murder of a man that some of them believed to be their Messiah. And that's where Pilate got involved. Pilate was well known for his brutality and was known for squashing these kinds of incidents. He had quite a temper, and Annas and Caiaphas didn't want a massacre on their watch. The words Caiaphas in John's gospel sums it all up when he gave the counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And that man was Jesus. So these spineless people pleasers passed the buck. They washed their hands of Jesus and passed him on to the Roman authorities, who had the legal right to execute Jesus by crucifixion. The problem was that the Roman procurator, Pontius Pilate, would laugh at their charge of blasphemy. He'd laugh it right out of court. So they needed to find some other trumped-up charge that would warrant the death sentence. You see, Pilate was not very popular even among his own countrymen. Pilate had a middle-class upbringing and started serving the Roman Empire at a very young age. While on a long stay in Rome one year, he got the attention of a Roman girl, Claudia, who just happened to be the granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. Because of Claudia's affections for him, Pilate was given a position that otherwise he never would have been given. And he certainly hadn't earned it. In AD 26, he was appointed the governor of Judea. And as governor, Pilate was in charge of administering all aspects of the Roman law. He was the head of the Roman judicial system. He collected taxes. He allocated spending for the province, and he was responsible for sending the taxes back to Rome. To say that he was ruthless would be an understatement. And during his time in Jerusalem, he was known for creating bloodshed when it came to dealing with the locals. In fact, his methods were so brutal and ruthless that the higher Roman authorities were keeping a very close eye on his actions. One more mistake, and rumor had it that he could kiss his job goodbye. In light of the political power structure at the time, Pilate had become a shrewd, politically correct type of politician who knew how to protect and preserve his own political power. What people don't really understand is that the high priesthood was a very complex political and religious office in first century Palestine. And the Romans controlled it as much as possible. In fact, the Romans appointed the high priests. For many years, a new high priest was appointed annually, but Caiaphas was reappointed for 18 years, including 10 years by Pilate. Caiaphas knew how to get along with the Romans. Let me just add that the reverse also seemed to be true, that Pilate knew how to get along with the high priest. Not sure why I'm telling you all this, but I guess it does help you to understand that Caiaphas and Pilate had the kind of relationship where they had a vested interest in keeping each other happy. So here is Pilate. He has a group of Jewish leaders standing before him, asking him to put this man to death. And notice what Pilate asks. He asks what we would consider to be a logical question. What are the charges? And as you might imagine, the answer was somewhat vague. The religious leaders say, if he were not a criminal, would we not have handed him over to you? In other words, Pilate, you know us. We wouldn't say he's a criminal if he wasn't. Just take our word for it and pass the sentence upon him. Well, Pilate didn't buy that. So eventually, the best that the religious community could come up with was that Jesus was a wrongdoer. And isn't that an interesting switch? They couldn't find a specific crime to convict Jesus of, so they tried to attack his character. I really don't know what they expected Pilate to do with that, but it's obvious that he wasn't impressed with the religious leaders wasting his time. They obviously were hoping that the Roman courts would impose the death penalty, but they rarely did those kinds of favors for the Jewish religious leaders. And even when they did, they would only do it if it served their own interests and if there was enough public support. And in this particular situation, Pilate understood enough to know that the amount of public support was very uncertain. Mark tells us that the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, they said, or people may riot. They had the concern that people would riot over this issue. My friends and I found it interesting that our Jewish leaders didn't head off to Pilate's official residence that night because they feared that being defiled would mean that they would be unable to participate in the feasts of the Passover. The irony is that they were careful about a defilement that would prevent them from taking part in this feast. But they didn't seem worried at all about taking part in an unjust judicial murder. At first, Pilate appeared to take this matter seriously, and he seemed to want to figure out for himself whether or not Jesus was guilty. I think he was looking hard to see if he could find just one piece of evidence that would make this an open and shut case. And oddly enough, kingship became an issue. He asks Jesus, "Are you the king?" Certainly, Jesus at that moment didn't look the part, and to even suggest such a thing was probably ridiculous to Pilate. In fact, I think that Pilate was insulted. Later, Pilate would go so far as to mockingly present Jesus to them as their king. And then Jesus said something that likely sealed his fate. Jesus implied that he was a king, but stated that his kingdom was not of this world, which to Pilate would have meant A, he certainly wasn't a zealot, B, he had no earthly military to back up his kingship, and C, that he had no intention of trying to overthrow the Romans. Well, I think that was the turning point for Pilate. In fact, you get the impression that it was that moment that he concluded that Jesus certainly didn't deserve to be executed, and he worked hard to try and appease the religious leaders. In fact, Pilate went so far as to flog Jesus and torture him, all the while hoping that the Jewish religious leaders would change their minds. At one point, and out of frustration, he yells at Jesus and says, "Don't you know that I have the power to release you or condemn you to death?" And Jesus responded back probably the words that made Pilate want to save him even more. Jesus says, "Power is not inherent, but it's derived, given by God." I've been thinking a lot about that statement, and maybe because I'm not sure that I understand what it means. I mean, Jesus could have said exactly what Pilate wanted to hear in that moment. Jesus could have said, "I do understand that you have the power to release me, and I'm innocent. I want to be released." But instead, Jesus' words sealed his fate. He had this window of opportunity to be released, and he didn't take it. And it's almost as if something else was going on here. It was almost as if he believed that his death could serve some greater purpose. It almost seems as if he was ready to die for some greater cause. It's just hard for me to believe that this was the way that Jesus chose to die. I overheard some of his followers talking about his arrest. Apparently they were in some garden and Jesus started to pray, and he kept saying and repeating over and over and over again to his heavenly Father, "Not my will be done, but yours." So why did he pray that? Why would he think that it was God's will that he die? Why would he think that his death could serve some greater purpose? What does he know that we don't? It's almost as if Jesus knew that his death was inevitable, that this was his destiny, that this was the reason that he had been sent to earth. It's almost as if he knew something that we didn't. You know, as I mentioned earlier, when we celebrate the Passover in my family, it's expected that the eldest son ask the father questions about that first Passover in the land of Egypt. I am an eldest son, and I have asked my father many questions about the Passover lamb. Why a lamb? Why did his blood need to be shed? Why did God require this kind of a sacrifice? What is that supposed to symbolize? And now I sit here as I'm talking to you and I wonder, after hearing what Jesus went through, was Jesus symbolically our Passover lamb?